A night owl discovers a hidden channel on his old TV, Channel 99, filled with static that soon reveals more than noise. Beneath the hiss, whispers pulse with rhythm, urging attention. The static sharpens into a reflection of his own apartment, showing himself asleep on the bed. Shadows gather around the figure, then breach the screen, pouring into the room. The boundaries between reality and broadcast collapse. The sleeper vanishes, leaving only the storm. Weeks later, the static reforms, showing the same apartment and a new figure trapped inside. The channel hums endlessly, whispering its final warning. Stay tuned. Let's begin the story. Night spread across the city with a heavy quiet that seeped through every window. Streetlights burned with a dull orange glow, flickering against cracked sidewalks and empty intersections. The hour slipped past midnight, when the noise of the world sank into stillness, and only machines hummed in the dark. Inside a narrow apartment pressed against the edge of the city, a television bled pale light into the room. The set stood on a low table, bulky and worn, its rounded screen buzzing faintly. Dust collected along its edges, disturbed only when the static roared. White grains swarmed across the glass, restless, endless, without pattern. The screen hissed, filling the air with a low electric breath. The glow painted the walls in shifting tones, pulling shadows across the floor. The rest of the apartment lay in silence, broken only by the static hum. The refrigerator in the kitchen clicked, then fell quiet again. The radiator rattled once, then stilled. The television remained alive, a single presence against the stillness of the night. At first the screen seemed empty, a storm of meaningless fragments. Yet as the minutes passed, the pattern shifted. Beneath the chaos, rhythm formed. The hiss pressed into the air with pulses that almost resembled intention. Shapes bled into the static, faint and uncertain, like images half hidden underwater. The mind strained for recognition. The longer the gaze held, the clearer the forms became. Shadows pressed forward, rising and fading in the storm. They leaned across the screen with uneasy balance, as if caught between one world and another. The eyes adjusted, refusing to blink, caught in the flood of white noise and dim suggestion. The air in the room thickened. The static no longer sounded random. It carried depth, a layering of tones that rose and fell like something alive. It burrowed into the ears and pressed against the chest. Beneath the chaos, faint order surfaced. The noise carried cadence, as though words buried themselves inside the current, waiting to be heard. The screen's movement sharpened. Outlines formed with heavier weight. Corners appeared, walls stretched upward. A ceiling dropped into place. The storm gave way to structure. A room surfaced inside the static storm, its edges crumbling in and out of view but holding shape with stubborn persistence. Recognition struck with sudden weight. The room within the screen mirrored the one outside it. Same walls, same furniture, same ceiling, stains that spread like dark maps. The television displayed not an illusion, but a reflection, as though the device had turned inward and revealed its own surroundings. The storm of static bent around the image, deepening detail grain by grain. At the center of the reflected room, a bed appeared. Sheets pulled tight across the mattress, creases sharp against the faint glow. The surface dipped with the weight of a body. A figure stretched across the bed, chest rising with slow rhythm, limbs draped heavy in sleep. The outline belonged not to a stranger, but to the very inhabitant of the room itself. A cold current slid through the air. Breath turned shallow. Muscles tightened without command. The television captured not only the room, but the body within it, resting unguarded beneath thin sheets. The sight pressed against the mind with unnatural precision. The screen no longer behaved as a receiver, but as an eye, watching the present unfold from inside its storm. The static thickened again. The figure on the bed stirred. Fingers twitched against the mattress. The chest lifted and fell with heavier force. The sleeper shifted in the glow, face tilting toward the television's light. Within the storm, the eyes of the reflected figure opened. The screen held the open eyes with unbroken focus. They stared through the haze of static, heavy with a dull, unblinking weight. The body on the bed did not rise, did not move further, yet its gaze reached forward, fixed on the glow as if tethered to the machine. The apartment outside the glass felt smaller, reduced to a narrow pocket in which the television hummed as the only source of life. The hours passed without measure. The room darkened further, night thickening beyond the windows until only the orange glow of distant streetlights brushed the edges of the blinds. Inside, the air cooled, and the radiator gave no more heat. The only sound came from the static storm, a ceaseless hiss that wrapped the air with electric pressure. Sleep never arrived. Each time the body leaned back, eyes closing against fatigue, the static surged louder, demanding return. The storm pulled the gaze forward until eyelids lifted again and focus locked once more on the shifting haze. The rhythm beneath the noise grew clearer with each repetition. Words formed but never completed themselves, syllables buried beneath distortion. Yet the cadence pressed with purpose, beating in steady waves until recognition teased the edge of comprehension. Days bled together. Curtains stayed drawn, food remained untouched on the counter, and dust settled deeper across the shelves. The television dominated the hours, a constant pulse that swallowed time. The outside world faded, replaced by the glow that promised revelation inside its storm. Work calls went unanswered, knocks at the door faded into silence, and life shrank to the radius of the screen's light. The images sharpened with relentless persistence. First the bed, then the figure, then the subtle presence of shadows at the edges. They crept across the walls inside the static room, too faint to define yet steady in their progression. Their forms bent unnaturally, long and stretched as if pulled by unseen hands. They leaned over the sleeper, hovered above the mattress, and then retreated again into the storm. The body on the bed grew restless. Each new image carried greater detail. The slow turn of a head, the twitch of limbs, the rise of breath that lifted the chest with unnatural heaviness. At times, the sleeper seemed alive, caught mid-dream. At others, the stillness suggested a body drained of will, suspended only by the weight of static. Obsession deepened. Every night, the same ritual unfolded. The television buzzed to life, the storm surged across the screen, and the reflection of the apartment returned with precise cruelty. The figure on the bed always remained, caught in endless sleep, while shadows circled in growing numbers. The watcher leaned closer, searching for meaning, hunting for signs within the blur, unable to release the grip of the broadcast. Soon the boundaries between screen and room dissolved. Reflections appeared not only of the bed, but of the entire apartment in wider detail. The chair in the corner emerged grain by grain. The small table with scattered papers surfaced in the storm. The faint outline of the door revealed itself in shifting bursts. The television mapped the space with uncanny accuracy, projecting every angle as if countless unseen cameras observed from hidden corners. The body in the bed remained central, but the perspective shifted. At times the view drifted higher, staring down from the ceiling. At others the screen leaned low, capturing the outline of feet dangling from the mattress. Each angle arrived with unnatural precision, as if the static itself crawled along invisible tracks to study the room from every possible vantage. The shadows within the storm grew bolder. Once faint, now they pressed closer to the sleeping figure. Elongated arms reached toward the bed, tapering into sharp lines that hovered inches from the chest. Faces never formed, yet impressions of eyes burned within the blur, watching with unbroken hunger. Their numbers multiplied, surrounding the mattress, pressing inward night after night. The hiss filled the room beyond bearable volume. Walls vibrated with its current, windows trembled in their frames, and the very air seemed to pulse with electricity. The noise bored into bone, seeping beneath the skin, weaving through nerves until the body felt wrapped in static. The storm's rhythm repeated endlessly, the same cadence beating like a heart that belonged not to flesh, but to the machine itself. Time collapsed. Daylight arrived but went unnoticed. Curtains never parted, clocks never checked, routines abandoned. Only the screen remained, alive in its endless storm. The reflection of the apartment now appeared more real than the space outside it, each detail clearer in static grain than in waking sight. The line between observer and subject blurred. The figure on the bed opened its eyes again. This time they did not stare with dull weight. They moved. They shifted side to side, scanning the room inside the storm. Their focus carried awareness, heavy and deliberate, as though something inside the static now understood the presence beyond the glass. And then the gaze turned outward. Through the haze, the eyes aligned with unnatural precision, locking on the watcher outside the screen. The connection froze the room in stillness. Every muscle stiffened, every breath caught. The storm hissed louder, pressing the moment deeper, holding it in place as though the static itself refused release. The reflection no longer mirrored reality, it observed. The connection lingered in the silence, locked between screen and room, gaze and gaze. The eyes within the storm burned with cold precision, unblinking, unshaken, alive with intent. The reflection had crossed a boundary, no longer a simple echo of space, but a presence aware of its subject. The air thickened, pressing down in heavy weight, as if the walls themselves bent inward under the force of recognition. Shadows multiplied inside the static storm. They swarmed the reflection of the apartment, stretching along the walls, climbing toward the ceiling, pooling in corners that deepened into black voids. Their movements sharpened. Where once they drifted vague and formless, now they extended limbs with clear intent, angular and deliberate. They circled the bed with measured steps, gathering closer with each surge of static. The figure on the mattress did not stir. The chest rose and fell in rhythm with the storm, tethered to its current. The body lay caught in a state beyond natural rest, neither peaceful nor restless, suspended between existence and absence. Yet the eyes within the storm tracked with unbroken precision, following the watcher outside the screen. The gaze held no warmth, no trace of recognition, only a hollow reflection of being alive. The television's hum deepened. The static no longer resembled noise. It carried tone, low and resonant, vibrating through the air until furniture trembled and the floor beneath shuddered. The ceiling light swayed, though no wind passed through. The refrigerator in the kitchen fell silent. The radiator stilled, as if every machine in the apartment yielded to the television's command. Grain by grain, the screen's storm pushed outward. Static bled from the glass in faint ribbons, curling across the air like smoke. They spread into the room, thin at first, dissolving before they reached the floor, but each night they thickened. They gathered at the edges of the television frame, spilling over in threads that wavered like strands of light and shadow combined. The boundary faltered. Shadows pressed against the surface from the inside, their forms warping the glass. Long arms stretched forward, fingertips tapping against the barrier with steady persistence. Each touch sent ripples through the storm, bending the reflection of the apartment inside. The hiss of the television rose to piercing levels, filling the room with unbearable static, drowning every other sound. The watcher leaned closer, compelled against will. The body stiffened, every instinct urging retreat. Yet the eyes refused to turn away. The storm demanded presence, demanded submission, pulling focus until nothing existed but the glass. Each shadow's movement carried rhythm, coordinated as if guided by unseen law. Their limbs lifted in unison, their forms aligned, and then they struck the surface together. The glass bulged outward. Cracks split along the screen's corners, thin at first, then branching like veins across the surface. Light poured from the fractures, sharp and white, cutting through the darkened apartment. The static storm roared with new violence, shaking the walls, rattling dishes in the kitchen, pounding against the chest with crushing force. The reflection inside the screen no longer remained stable. The bed warped, the figure twisted, the shadows swelled until their forms consumed the entire image. The room inside bent and folded, collapsing into chaos as the static reached outward. The barrier weakened further with each surge. Then the breach arrived. A single hand broke through. It emerged from the glass in a burst of light and static, long and colorless, skin stretched thin over impossible joints. Fingers clawed the air, grasping for anchor. Another hand followed, then arms, shoulders, and the outline of a head pressed forward from the storm. The apartment filled with the smell of ozone and burned metal, the taste of electricity coating the air. The figure that emerged carried no features. Its form stretched long and unnatural, built of shadow and static combined, a shifting blur of limbs that bent and corrected with every motion. It stepped into the room with deliberate weight, leaving streaks of static that fizzed and dissolved across the floor. The reflection had escaped. The apartment no longer felt solid. Corners bent at impossible angles, shadows lengthened far beyond their natural reach, and the air shimmered with distortion. The figure from the storm crossed the room in silence, moving with slow certainty toward the bed. The body on the mattress remained frozen, eyes open, chest rising and falling, with the rhythm of static. The shadow leaned above it, bending low, stretching arms that hovered inches above the sleeper. The screen continued to hiss, its storm raging with endless fury, now reflecting both the bed and the figure that had escaped into the room. The image looped, doubling upon itself, feeding one reality into another until the boundary vanished. The watcher stood between screen and bed, caught in the loop of reflection and presence. Every nerve strained under the weight of the storm. The static roared, the figure bent closer, and the eyes on the bed turned again, no longer toward the glass, but toward the one still standing in the room. The gaze struck with unbearable force. The eyes on the bed locked against the presence in the room, carrying no humanity, no memory, only the hollow weight of recognition from the storm. The shadow leaned lower, arms stretching until fingers hovered above the sleeper's chest. The static roared at a pitch that split through bone, rattling every nerve, drilling deep into the skull with merciless persistence. The apartment collapsed under distortion. Corners folded inward, ceiling pressed lower, walls rippled as if constructed from liquid rather than stone. Every surface pulsed with static grain, each detail flickering between reality and reflection. The television no longer stood as a device, but as an open wound in the room. Its glass shattered yet alive, spilling white fire and black storm into every inch of space. The figure bent deeper. Its hands descended. The static storm surged with final violence, shaking the floor, buckling the furniture, splitting the air with light. The shadow pressed its form into the body on the bed. The mattress dipped, sheets pulled tight, chest collapsed under the weight of something impossible. The eyes of the sleeper widened, glowing white with the storm's fury, then dimmed into hollow absence. In a single burst, the body vanished. Sheets flattened, mattress stilled, the bed left empty. The shadow dissolved into the storm, drawn back into the television with a final surge of light. The glass sealed itself in silence. The static softened into a low, steady hiss. The apartment fell still. Dust drifted through faint shafts of light from the blinds. The radiator rattled once, weak and uncertain, then silenced again. The refrigerator hummed faintly. Ordinary sounds returned, thin and distant, like echoes struggling to break through a barrier. The television remained alive, its screen filled once more with static, calm and endless, as if nothing had ever passed through. The bed remained empty. The reflection within the static no longer showed the room in detail. The shadows had retreated, the figure had disappeared, and the storm carried only the endless swirl of white and black grains. Yet beneath the noise, the rhythm continued. The cadence repeated itself, steady as a heart, low as a breath. Time dragged forward. Days shifted without notice. The apartment grew stale, air thick with dust and silence. The television never turned off. The static burned through nights and mornings alike, its glow the only constant presence. The bed remained untouched. The walls held their stains. The reflection within the storm never returned to detail, yet the rhythm never ceased. Weeks passed. The outside world pressed on with footsteps in the hall, muffled laughter through walls, traffic humming in the streets. Inside, the apartment stood sealed, curtains drawn, air unmoving, life absent. Only the television remained alive, buzzing softly, whispering its endless hiss into the silence. Then the image returned. The static bent again, slow and deliberate, pressing shapes into place. A room emerged inside the storm, sharper than before. The walls stretched upward with familiar cracks. The ceiling sagged with the same dark stains. Furniture surfaced in grainy precision. The chair in the corner, the table beneath stacks of forgotten papers, the unmade bed stripped of presents. The reflection mirrored the apartment once more, whole and clear. But the bed was no longer empty. Another figure occupied the mattress. A body lay sprawled across the sheets, chest rising in rhythm with the hiss, limbs draped heavy and still. The shape carried weight, detail, undeniable presence. The storm revealed a new sleeper, captured in endless rest, trapped within the reflection of the room. The static swelled, louder, sharper, filling the apartment with a hiss that pressed against the chest and drilled into the skull. Beneath the roar, the rhythm returned with new force. The cadence beat with final clarity, no longer buried in distortion but sharp, deliberate, alive. It carried words now. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening. Hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe.